Welcome everybody to INE's Intro to Juniper JunOS. My name is Brian McGann and I'm going to be the instructor for this particular class. For those of you that have not attended any classes with me before, I am primarily a Cisco engineer, being a 4-time CCIE in routing and switching, service provider security, and data center, as well as a Cisco certified design expert. Of course, in this class, we're going to be focusing on Juniper JunOS, but we're also going to be talking about interoperability with Cisco iOS and other variations of Cisco iOS XR, Catalyst iOS, and so on. So what is this particular class? What is Intro to JunOS? The main idea behind this class is that you understand networking, you understand other operating systems, potentially Cisco iOS, and now you want to transfer this knowledge to Juniper's JunOS. So maybe you have a new position coming up that the particular network is using Juniper either for their edge routing, their edge firewalls, their core routing, and then you need to quickly transfer that knowledge, your existing knowledge, into the Juniper syntax. So as a recommended prerequisite for this class, ideally you already have an understanding of network technologies, things like Ethernet switching, layer 3, IPv4, and IPv6 routing, both with IGPs like OSPF and ISIS and BGP, and then also some additional network services like MPLS or multicast. I am going to expect that everyone has at least an intermediary understanding of Cisco iOS, the syntax structure, how to do basic configurations, how to do verifications, because we'll see that the way the class is going to be formatted, a lot of it is going to be comparing and contrasting how something is implemented in the Cisco iOS world, and then how do we implement that in Juniper JunOS. So if you've never used JunOS before, then you're fine. So we don't expect you to have any other previous knowledge of how Juniper does its implementations. Basically, we're going to be starting from scratch, looking at the differences between the specific CLI syntax in Juniper JunOS versus Cisco's iOS. So the ultimate goal of this class then is for everyone to get a basic working knowledge of JunOS. Now, as I mentioned, this is an intro class. We're not going to be going into lots of advanced implementation examples. So we're not going to talk about the design of large-scale technologies, so the design of MPLS networks, the design of BGP and large-scale enterprise networks. We're mainly focusing on the syntax implementation. So we want to make sure that when you come out of the class, that you have a basic understanding of the syntax structure differences between JunOS and iOS. You know some of the differences between them and also some of the similarities, so that you can immediately start either supporting networks that are using JunOS or doing new implementations. So the main focus then is going to be learning JunOS through implementation examples. So beyond this, there's not going to be tons of slides that I'm going to be using in the class. Most of them are just going to be a baseline for syntax references that we're then going to be applying on the command line interface. So what is this class not then? First and foremost, it's not a certification class. So you could theoretically use the knowledge that we're going to be talking about to take the Juniper certification exams, but we're not going to be talking about those specifically. So not about the blueprints, not about the actual exams. The other thing also is that this is not a product class. So we're not going to be talking about the specific Juniper hardware options, what are the differences in the interfaces and the port density in Cisco versus Juniper. We're mainly focusing on just the operating system, just JunOS. Also, additionally, this is not a technology theory class. So I'm not going to be spending tons of time talking about what is BGP, what is MPLS, how do the designs work. We're mainly focusing on just the CLI implementations. Now, as we're going through these, if you guys have questions on the topics, feel free to ask. But as I mentioned, the main focus is just the implementation on JunOS. I can also point you at additional resources if you do have specific questions on the technologies. And we do have lots of other classes, lots of other video series that are available that cover the particular topics from a technology point of view that we are going to be focusing on. So what are the topics then? First and foremost, we're going to start with just the basics of the CLI. Things that you normally take for granted when you're working on platforms that you already know. Maybe you've been working with iOS for 5 or 10 years, but you never used Juniper before. Something as simple as starting the CLI process, or resetting the router or the switch to its initial config. So we'll go through the basics of how does the syntax structure work, how does the hierarchy of JunOS work differently than it is in iOS, talk about the different show command formats, talk about the configuration format, and then ultimately start to get into the actual implementation examples. So from a technology point of view, we'll then start with Ethernet switching, which is going to be on the EX series switches. We'll go through the basics of IPv4 and IPv6 addressing and static routing. Then we'll start to get into some more details of the implementation of routing, both in IGPs and BGP. Talk about MPLS services, both from label switching in the MPLS core, MPLS traffic engineering in the core, and then applications like MPLS Layer 3 VPN and Layer 2 VPN. Talk about what are some of the differences in the standards that are supported in JunOS versus iOS, and then how we interoperate when we have a mixed vendor in the service provider edge or core. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how multicast is implemented in Juniper's JunOS. Now, from a hardware point of view, from the actual CLI configuration, I'm going to be using a mix of both Cisco and Juniper boxes. And specifically, the Juniper ones are going to be the SRX firewalls, or the services gateways, which is going to be SRX 210, both as a physical box and as a virtual machine. So this link here for Firefly Perimeter, essentially what this is a virtual machine that runs the version of the SRX firewall. And if you haven't seen this before, you can just search for that keyword, Firefly Perimeter, and then you can also download an eval of it if you want to try out some of these particular examples. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the particular hardware that I'm using once we get onto the CLI, and just talk about generics of how this kind of correlates to the Cisco boxes. But the particular platforms that I'm using are kind of low level in the scheme of what the Juniper boxes are. So it's not like a core 40 gig, 100 gig E Ethernet switch that we're going to be working with. But similar to how Cisco does it with either iOS or iOS XR, the OS is the same regardless of what platform that you're using it on. So if you're trying to learn just the syntax structure, how does it differ from one versus another, then this is one of the great ways that you can get access to the equipment basically for free in order to try out these particular examples. From a layer 2 switch point of view, we're going to be using the EX2200s, which are basically the equivalent of the access layer switches like Catalyst 2950, Catalyst 3560 in terms of iOS. And then specifically for the iOS boxes, we're going to have a different mix of routers that are running regular iOS, where we have the 7200 VXRs, which is the traditional enterprise edge router for Cisco. We also have the virtualized version of that, which is the cloud services router, the CSR 1000V, which is like the Firefly Perimeter, is basically a virtual machine that runs the OS, and it's fully functional. We'll see from a syntax point of view, just like the Juniper VSRX is. Then from a service provider core and service provider edge point of view, we also have iOS XR, specifically version 3.9 here, which is going to be running on the gigabit switch router, which is the 12,000 series router. And then we'll talk about how that is similar to JunOS in terms of committing the configs, doing rollbacks, how the hierarchy of the syntax structure works. And then finally to the enterprise access layer Ethernet switches. So Catalyst 3560, and then the Metro Ethernet switches, which is the ME3400. We'll talk about some of the interoperability between the Catalyst switches and the Juniper EX series. Now, from a physical topology point of view, you'll see here the specific wiring of how the topology is set up. And like I mentioned, this is going to be a mix of both JunOS boxes and iOS. So we'll talk about things like configuring trunking, configuring link aggregation, configuring routing, and then not only how do we do it between two JunOS boxes, but also how do we interoperate in terms of things like running rapid spanning tree, running IGB routing, running MPLS, because you'll see not all of these are going to be 100% straightforward when you look at some of the interoperability caveats between the two different OSs. Now, from a logical topology point of view, this physical topology we're going to be using mainly for Ethernet in order to accomplish things like building layer 2 Ethernet trunks, doing link aggregation. And then once we've built our physical topology, we're going to be overlaying a layer 3 logical topology on top of this that we're going to be using for our routing examples. So routing is going to be done both in IP version 4 and IP version 6, both with the IGPs, BGP, MPLS, and IPv4 multicast routing. So if you look at the file share, you should see a link to it under the class feed, which is ine.co/JunOS. And that should link you to not only the copy of the slides in PDF format, but also these particular diagrams if you want to follow along specifically with what I'm doing throughout the class. Now, in terms of additional resources beyond just this particular video series, one of the ones that I would recommend to start with, assuming that you have no experience at all with Juniper, is a series on their website that they call the Day 1 booklets. So these are free to download. You just sign up for a basic account on Juniper's website, and then this goes over pretty much just basically intro topics on JunOS, things like just exploring the CLI, understanding the JunOS basics, and then they get into some more advanced examples like how does QoS work in Juniper versus iOS, and there's also a specific series here that's Juniper for iOS engineers. So again, this is free on their website. It's called the Day 1 booklets. The other one, of course, is going to be the actual documentation. So just like Cisco iOS, the final word on the technologies is really going to be both the command reference and the configuration guides. Now, for those of you that are familiar with Cisco's documentation, you'll see that really the formatting of the Juniper one, at least in my opinion, is not as great as the Cisco documentation. So you may find it a little bit easier just to do a Google search inside Juniper site. So you could say like site:/juniper.net and then the particular topic that you're looking for. It's not really as straightforward, at least in my opinion, like I said, to navigate it manually as opposed to the Cisco documentation. Now, in terms of books, there's a number of different books that are available on the Safari online site. So if you already have a Safari subscription, the 4 of these here are available there. The first one, JunOS for Dummies, is essentially just an intro book that talks about how does the syntax structure work of JunOS, and some other basic examples of, how do I configure syslogging, how do I configure SSH and Telnet. So this is a pretty good intro book, and I believe a lot of it actually comes from the same thing as the Day 1 series. So either it's kind of like a copy and paste of the documentation or some of the other resources. But if you already have a Safari subscription, I would recommend to quickly kind of skim through this book, especially the sections that just talk about the intro to the CLI. The other main two are going to be JunOS Enterprise Switching and JunOS Enterprise Routing. Now, beyond just the implementation, these books do talk about the technology theory. So if you already know how LAN switching works, how spanning tree works, you could pretty much just skip those sections and then just look at their implementation examples. But if there's some technology that you don't already know, like MPLS, for example, then those books also include the technology theory overview. Then the last one, the JunOS Cookbook, is basically just a collection of syntax examples that show you how do I implement this particular feature. So for example, how do I configure an IPsec tunnel? Or how do I configure SNMP polling and trapping? So this is really, really useful if you already know, again, what are these protocols and what are the general features, and you just want to know the implementation. So how do you configure virtual router redundancy protocol, VRRP, on an Ethernet interface? And then it just simply shows you what the syntax format is.